So the main reason that we're here is to talk about energy use in buildings and how we can model it and help our students understand it. And it's important to know why this is so significant. So the US Energy Information Administration reported recently that 39% of the energy used in the US is used by buildings. And so this is an enormous cost. It also is an enormous energy impact. And so in the industry, there's a major focus on how do we reduce energy consumption. And so there are many ideas that you can think about for doing that in a building. For example, you could upgrade to more energy efficient lighting. You can change scheduling and set points. You can update mechanical systems. You can improve the building envelope. But once you make those upgrades, all of those upgrades have a cost. And so it's really important to understand what's going to be the return on the investment that you're making. How significant are these changes going to be? And so energy modeling is what helps us make decisions about what strategies we're going to use to try to make changes to a building, to try to see how do we save energy, how do we lower carbon equivalent emissions for a building, how do we do all of this kind of work. And so in the building energy industry, there is a standard computational tool that's used to do this. It's called DOE2, produced by the US Department of Energy. It's been in use for many, many years. And it actually works remarkably well because it's built to interface with weather data for weather stations, historical weather data that's close to the location where you site the building. And so a building is going to behave differently in Chicago, for example, than it will in Miami. And DOE2, among many other things, is built to be able to interface with other input data to make an accurate model of the way that a building might use energy. And so DOE2 can be used in and of itself. There's a user interface that works with it that's called eQuest, but both of these are relatively difficult to use. You need to download them, you need to install them. There's a pretty steep learning curve. You have to understand how to feed particular building characteristics into those models. And so what Slipstream has done, that's been such a good advance. Slipstream has actually created Sketchbox, and Sketchbox is a web interface that works with DOE2. And so Slipstream is not separate from DOE2. DOE2 is running in the background, but Slipstream is a web interface that passes input information to DOE2 so that DOE2 can run the model and then provide results back to the web interface. And so because of this, the interface is online. Nothing needs to be downloaded. The learning curve is much, much less. There's an option to use it for free. And more importantly, in schools, you can use this as a teaching tool because you can run this on a student Chromebook. You don't need a site license. You don't need to work with tech administrators to try to install this on student computers or in computers in a lab. You can use this very easily from a Chromebook. And that's what I've done with my own students. So that's really helpful. I'll mention also that Sketchbox also has preloaded data of many types, and we'll see those as we start to work through. But you can specify a building type and all of the sort of typical industry design parameters that come with that. And you can specify systems and technologies, so the type of heating system, the type of cooling system. Just like I mentioned for DOE2, you set the location, so you actually set a state and the nearest major city so that you're sure that you're getting weather information that's as close as possible to your location. In addition, this updates by state to give you state utility rates. And that turns out to be really important because the utility generation mix for electricity, for example, is different in different states. And that has really big implications for carbon emissions. And so all of this flexibility is built into Sketchbox in a way that we can easily access custom information and make detailed specifications for the building that we're trying to design. So I'll say briefly why we might want to teach this to students, and then we'll come back and just discuss careers a little bit further after this introduction. But I think one of the main reasons we want to teach this to students is just an awareness of resource utilization. Students don't really understand how much energy that buildings actually use. I can anecdotally say in my own classroom, I can look out the window of my physics classroom and I can see 8 solar modules on the roof of our building. And when I point them out to my physics students, it's almost been without fail in every class that someone asks, is that where all the electricity from the building comes from? As if those 8 modules are going to be able to provide all the electricity for a 2,000 student high school. And so just a sense of scale and idea of resource utilization is really important. And that starts to come from working with Sketchbox. I think you can start to think about a cost benefit analysis. So you can make a building upgrade and then see how it impacts immediately the annual energy cost for a building. And so that's been really rewarding to work with that for students. And honestly, this actually just motivates and excites students about climate solutions. And so it lets them see they're concerned about climate, but they don't know what are the things that you can do to start making a large scale difference. They might be able to make some small changes in their own lives in the way that they do transportation or thinking about diet or making sure that they're conserving energy just by turning off lights in unneeded rooms, for example. They can do those simple things, but they want to know about much larger things. And so this is a way to motivate and excite students about large-scale climate solutions. And then additionally, this really connects to many, many careers. And so, for example, the career of building manager, energy engineer, careers in architecture, HVAC, design and installation, energy analysts, construction and contractors, sustainability. So there are lots of ways for students to start to envision their own future. And Sketchbox really helps students think about all of the changes that we make, all of the systems that are in these buildings, all need professionals to work on them. And so it's a really nice connection in that way as well. And we'll learn a little bit later about the new energy pathway that's been put together by the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction that connects very well to this. There's also tremendous job growth right now in renewable energy, in part because of the Inflation Reduction Act and incentives and possibilities that are provided there. And we'll have a chance to look later also at the Green Buildings Career Map, which really has some fantastic career level resources for students that have a lot of information about education, compensation, and type of work, and everything that goes into that. If you were to open Sketchbox, here is the first screen that you would see. And so this is called the Project tab. I'm going to move with my mouse here just to highlight that Project tab right there. And so this has basically general information about the building, its location, the energy code that we're using. There's actually a lesson that I've built that helps navigate this energy code tab, the rate category that the building is paying into, the cost of electricity per kilowatt hour, cost of natural gas per therm, and then also the carbon equivalent emissions for both electricity per kilowatt hour and natural gas per therm of natural gas that's used. And so this is the Project tab. And then I'm going to skip right away to the punchline. And so imagine we've set up a project in Sketchbox, and now we'd like to analyze this building. When we head over to the Results tab, what you're going to see is a summary table that looks like this. And so you can see on the right of this table the categories of energy use that are here for this building, things like heat rejection, cooling, heating, pumps, interior lighting. And so that this bar chart represents the energy cost that you see for this building. And if you hover over any of the segments in this bar chart, you'll actually get a detailed annual cost. So right now I've hovered when I made this image over the heating bar chart, and that gave me actually $5,293 annual energy cost for this building for heating. And so you can see you can get very detailed cost information for the energy utilization of the building, and then you can change the building to see how that energy cost changes. If I go to the next chart here, this actually is the same chart, I should say, but I just expanded this top bar right here. And what you'll notice is that in addition to the energy cost, there are 6 other ways for us to describe this energy. And so we can talk about carbon dioxide emissions, we can look at electricity use, we can look at natural gas use, we can look at site energy, and we can also look at source energy. So those are all options that are provided in these results tabs. In addition to the summary table, the annual summary table, we have a monthly breakdown. And so you can see month by month, as you might expect, for example, here in January, we have a relatively large heating cost. In July, that heating cost disappears. This building was actually modeled in Chicago. But in July, there's a large cooling cost. that we didn't see in January. And so a very detailed information, not only over the course of a year, but even down to the monthly level for this analysis. And then finally, at the bottom of the results page, we'll actually also see an annual summary table that adds some additional information. And so in addition to the total electric consumption, the total natural gas consumption, the total energy cost, you can also see that Sketchbox is thinking about water use. And especially you're looking at peak cooling and peak heating and peak electric demand. And those can be really valuable because schools sometimes are set up on utility rate plans where their rates depend a little bit on the peak demand. And so that's another really interesting educational aspect of the way that utility services work that can be built in. And actually Create has a number of lessons that can actually help with that, the way that demand charges work. And so that information is also available to you in Sketchbox. Okay, additionally, for the first lesson that we use, we're going to use one other tab in Sketchbox. So we won't go through the entire menu right now. We'll build through that over the day. But this is what's called the Design tab. And so I've done this here, rather than just go right to Sketchbox, I decided to put these on slides so we can zoom in and just look at them a little more carefully. And so you can see that you can adjust the building type. In this menu here, I've chosen school or university. There are about 25 different building types that you can choose from. We'll explore those in just a little bit. You'll have a chance to explore those. You can also make a lot of different adjustments. So for example, you can update the area of the building in square feet, the number of floors to help describe the structure of the building, the perimeter zone depth. You can also specifically look at the glazing type here. I know this was really important. My own district is doing some building renovations right now. And we had some careful discussions about whether you can open the windows or not. And so fenestration is another name for the window openings in a building. And fixed fenestration means that we have windows that are not operable, that you can't open. And so if these were operable, if this was operable fenestration, we'd have windows that we could. Right here, we're looking at actually window to wall ratio. So this tells us how much window area do we actually have on the walls of our building. The numbers here, 22 on every face of the building, are set up to be typical for a school or university building across the industry. But any particular building is going to vary from this. And so you could have students actually do some measurements on a school building and make modifications to these numbers as they're modeling a building. You can also go through and say, maybe we don't want a lot of window space on the north wall, for example. We live in a cold climate. We're going to reduce what's on the north wall of a building we're designing, and we're going to increase the window space on the south wall to try to increase solar heat gain, and also maybe to maximize lighting in the building space. And so all of those changes can be made at a very detailed level. You can add skylights. Right now, the skylight to roof ratio in this building is 0, which means it doesn't have skylights, but you could add them. And then you can make adjustments to the mechanical systems. And so we won't do that immediately, but I've got some of that set up to talk about near the end of our day. And so this building is set for natural gas heat, packaged variable air volume systems with hot water reheat, a specific type of cooling system, a direct expansion cooling system with a natural gas boiler, and without a dedicated outdoor air system. And so you can see there's a pretty good level of mechanical specification that you can get to in the Design tab. And later in the day, we'll actually look at the Baseline tab, which allows us to set even more parameters for these systems. And so we have a natural gas boiler. We can actually specify the efficiency of that boiler. And so there's really a lot that Sketchbox can do. And so it's quick to get started with, but can also be very powerful and do very detailed analysis. Okay, so in the first lesson that we work through, I'm going to help you just walk through studying how students might analyze setting building type, how they might change location, window fraction, and some of those parameters. And in our second lesson, we'll actually talk quite a bit about energy code. If we scroll down just a little bit, you'll see, first of all, here a video introduction. And what's interesting to know about this, we'll come back to it later, but if you look up here in the corner, you'll notice that this is video 1 of 13. And so Slipstream has a great YouTube channel for Sketchbox. And so in addition to this video overview, there are actually many tutorials to help you with each of the tabs in Sketchbox. And also there's a really nice case study of a library building that's in Sun Prairie. And so there's some great resources there. If we scroll down just a little bit further, you'll see this start using Sketchbox today. And so if I click on that, it opens just like this. Some of you may have created accounts already. If you have, that's where you'll log in. So I'm going to log myself in live right now. And when you start later, if you haven't used Sketchbox before, you'll just go down to create account. It's a simple form. It's about maybe 10 fields, which are things like your email address and your institution and that sort of thing. It's a free account. You will need access to the email address that you use because you'll get a validation link once you create your account. So do remember that when you get to logging into Sketchbox later. Okay, let's see here. So let me just zoom in a little bit on this. And so what we're looking at right here, everyone. Pardon me, I've got to get a taskbar out of the way. There we go. Here is Sketchbox, and it's running live right now. And here is the project tab that we looked at before. And so if we jump to baseline, let's see. Oh, sorry, maybe it's on the design tab. Here we go. So here's the design tab. And so we looked a little bit at this before. I had kind of zoomed in on some of the features. And so if I just kind of scroll down, you can see all of the applications we were looking at before. So for example, the type of heater for the domestic hot water, the type of heating system. Up near the top, you can see we can switch over to the site. And so I think if we switch right there, now we have here information about the site orientation. So Gabe, this was the question that you had before. So we can actually get at the azimuth angle of the site orientation right there. And you can see actually the compass rose that we have here in the heading. Okay, so hey, I wanted Jim, to make just...
I just want to interrupt you for a moment here. Dave Ludy is asking, can students make their own accounts or did they use one that the school has?
Yeah, great question. So when I worked with my students, I had my students make their own account and that worked just fine. The one important thing to know is that students they need to have access to the email. They need to use a working email account to be able to set up this account. And so that's necessary again because of the account validation. It might be worth it just to check with your school administration that they're okay with their students using their email addresses to set up an account, but I don't know of any difficulties with that off the top of my head, and my school was fine with it.
I don't want to interrupt your flow here, but Joe Phillips has a question kind of related from a student perspective. If I want to be able to evaluate student projects, is it best to have them share their account with me? And I don't know if you want to share that later on, like how you do the assessment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So sharing of accounts, I don't actually know if it's possible to share an account unless the student will give you, for example, their login and password. More commonly, what I've done with my students is have them, there's some pretty nice copy and paste features to be able to extract data from the results, or you can have students help you with taking a screen image and sending you, sending a screenshot, for example. And so that's one of the ways that I've assessed student work. You can also actually have students enter results into a Google form so that you have the student's name in one column and you can easily see in one form from a Google form or similar tool, you can export to a spreadsheet version. And so you can basically see row by row the work of each student in terms of the numerical output. And so you can identify quickly things that you want to go back and look at for students. And so there are a number of ways to do that. I think one of the things that I did that I really enjoyed, I set up a Google Sheet and then had students work in groups, and basically each group pasted their summary data right into the Google Sheet. So then I could share that entire sheet with the class from a video projector, and then we could have a class discussion just going through group by group about all the different results. So that's been really successful for me as well. Okay, great. Samara, any other questions that you're seeing? I'm going to just check back to the chat real quick.
Not right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Grateful for these questions, everybody. Keep them coming. I think they'll be really helpful for our work today. Okay, so those are some of the basics of Sketchbox. Let's actually do just one last thing while we're here working live with Sketchbox, and then we'll jump back into our presentation to set up for our first lesson. And so here is the project tab again. I recommend giving your project a name, especially so even if you come back later, you can tell if you're working with a saved project you're familiar with or with a new default project. You will notice right here that the default conditions are Chicago, Illinois, and we'll use those for some of our work today, but we'll also change and update them. The default is also the International Energy Conservation Code from 2018. I believe there exists now a 2021 code. That option is not available here in Sketchbox yet. I imagine it will be eventually. But interestingly, it takes a while for many municipalities to adopt energy codes. And so your local municipality may actually be a ways behind a 2018 code, or there's also a separate set of code body called ASHRAE, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So that information is here. We're going to leave that alone for our first lesson, and also the compliance path for the code compliance. We'll leave all that alone for right now. But once we've set our building, I'll go back to the design tab just for a moment. We're going to, since many of the work that we're doing for most of us will be with students, we'll change this to a school or university building, which is going to change some of the default parameters. It actually changes the size of the building right off the bat. This size, 150,000 square feet, I think is sort of a large elementary school or a middle school size building. This one is set as 2 floors. And let me actually show you quickly how the results calculation works. I think we'll see this work in the right way in real time. You can see right now Sketchbox took, maybe 10 seconds or a little less to run that model. If we're doing more detailed modifications to the default, it'll take longer. So I've had models that take up to 20 or 30 seconds to run. That's not an error. It's just the process of Sketchbox sending inputs out to Do2, and that model running in the background, and then results coming back to be reported. And so we're looking now at the same sort of summary information that I walked through in our slides before. And so you can see the annual table, the monthly bar graph that breaks down detailed information month by month of where all of this energy utilization in the building, what it's doing, and then the summary results table at the bottom. This little feature right here, there's a little clipboard here. This allows you to copy essentially this in all of the numbers in this results table. And that's what I had my students use basically to paste right into Google Sheets, so we could discuss group results as we work through. That was really convenient and effective for my students. I could share one sheet with them, and they could place all the results in one centralized place for discussion. I'm going to double check the chat real quick. It looks like, yes, great. So there was a question about saving work. And so, yes, you can save material offline. You can also save up to 2 separate projects, I think, with a free account. There is a paid upgrade that allows you more flexibility. But for my students, we were fine working with the free account. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing just for a moment, and we'll start to talk about our first lesson. So all of our lesson materials that we develop at Create and are sharing with Keep with the support of Slipstream operate under a Creative Commons license. And so you can copy and redistribute these. You can adapt them. Just please give credit and use them for non-commercial purposes, not sell them, for example. So the details of the license are here, and that you'll find that at the top of every one of our pages. And additionally, the first lesson that we're working with is really just an introduction to some of the basic features of Sketchbox. So I've called it Introduction to Building Models. But what I've also done here is try to link some of the science standards that I think it's most applicable to. So here in the US, we use the next generation science standards. And so I think specifically one of the high school content standards for engineering design is the one that I've listed here, is most appropriate for this first lesson. And then we also have in the next generation science standards, the science and engineering practices. And these are the 5 that I picked out that for this particular lesson that I think are the most appropriate. And I've also added just some meta tags for some of the things that are really important to this first lesson. So building design, computer modeling, data analysis, and efficiency, for example. And so you'll find those at the top of each of the lessons that I've written. And I hope that those will be helpful. And then the student materials themselves begin and look just like this. And so there's a brief introduction and some just context for what students are trying to do in the lesson. So a little bit of text material. And then we start in actually with some step-by-step instructions. And so I'm going to distribute this lesson in Microsoft Word form and also PDF and also Google Doc form. And hopefully you'll be able to work with one of those. An important thing to know right away, I'll put this separately in the chat, but this link right here is the link that will take you to the Sketchbox login. And so I encourage you, we're going to take a short break in just a moment. I encourage you during that break to log in or create an account and log in if you haven't already, and just start to take a short look at this. When we come back from the break, our first activity is going to be to split up into smaller breakout groups and have a chance to work through with a few other participants the first lesson. We'll take about 30 minutes to work through and discuss that. I'll be moving around from breakout room to breakout room to say hello and check on what questions you have. And that'll be another great time if there's something that you need to do offline, to just negotiate that with your group and get a chance to take care of those things. And then we'll come back right after that session.
As far as how students are responding to this lesson, I thought the lesson was like laid out very nice. You know, I could see, you know, my teams of students working through this. You know, I was wondering about, you know, how I could build off of this, like with like adding some more modeling of like the changes in data in some ways. I co-teach with a math teacher, and I'm always trying to find ways to like add more math into these lessons. It's one thing to kind of like flip a variable and record the results. But I wonder like where I could go from that, or I thought it was a nice lesson, and it was a nice way to kind of dip your toe in the water to get started using it.
Great, thank you for that. So now I want to just respond quickly to what you said with something that Joe mentioned earlier, actually. There's a great opportunity for unit conversions here, I think, as a simple math extension for high school students. And so, for example, to convert from maybe kilowatt hours to megawatt hours, for example, or to watt hours, something like that could be really useful. A conversion from therms to BTUs of natural gas, for example, something like that. So there are some good applications there. In one of the future lessons, I actually asked for students to do a simple relative savings calculation, for example. And Sketchbox will do some of those for you. And so students can actually do the calculations and then compare to what the model is calculating and make sure that they're doing their calculations correctly. So yeah, there are definitely some things like that built in. And this first lesson, really more than anything, is just to let students know what's possible. You know, I think you just you get a little view of the landscape on the way through, and you see maybe lots of things you could think about going back to and changing later. Craig, thank you for those comments. Anyone else from group one want to add anything before we move on to group two?
Yes, I would suggest to ask for the, you know, to exchanges in the building model using the same site location, and then exchange the window to wall ratio, and then exchange the area. And then, you know, to check the difference if we just exchange the windows and all those stuffs. It would be easier to compare, because we didn't find fair to compare the first model to the second one, because the area reduced it by half, right, and then the location. So we started to remodeling in the same location and just exchange the window to wall ratio, and then keeping the window to wall ratio and exchanging location to be more, I don't know, more fair in this analysis.
Yeah. So I'm really glad for that feedback, and you may have found a mistake in my directions or some lack of clarity in my directions, because that was the intent of my instructions, that you would, for example, cut the building size in half and then restore the building to its original size before making any further modifications, so that you would always be able to compare back to that top baseline row of the table. And so there may be a need for some bolding or to break a set of directions into further. So I made to do some editing there. So that's useful feedback. I appreciate that. Thank you. And you're exactly right. Really, in some ways, students are doing a computational experiment with Sketchbox, and we're trying to teach them, you're changing a variable, and let's be very careful about changing one variable at a time, so that we can understand the impact of that variable on the energy utilization. So absolutely, yeah, good. Anything else from group one? Otherwise, we'll move on to the group two spokesperson. Pat, please.
Well, I guess we were. Human nature being what it is, we were caught by the very colorful chart there, and we observed that you could spend a couple days just explaining that chart. Are the results under the chart for a reason? Because it could be a happy distraction, or it could be just a distraction.
Yeah, I see exactly what you say. I think with my students, I was maybe fortunate, maybe I accidentally, this worked out for me, since what they were reporting to me was the information in the summary table. They were kind of directed to get to the summary table. In my case, I was asking my students to copy those results directly into a shared document so we could compare across the class. And so that I didn't find too much problem with that, but I see exactly what you're saying. And in a way, you're wondering out loud if Sketchbox might redesign that results tab just with the summary, the numerical table at the top, and then the charts below it, just to reorder it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just make the observation. I am not, in fact, an instructor, but I'm the administrator of this program. And so the group we have chosen does have reading challenges. And so I could imagine them looking at this picture going, here's something I can deal with, right? Never mind all these words. So it might help, to separate them.
Yeah, so I'm actually really glad for that comment. It reminds me of something else that I think is important. Working with my physics students, I often have a pretty good degree of technical knowledge in terms of energy units and units of measurement and some of those things, which would not always be the case in different areas of students you might use this material with. Additionally, I mentioned before, I'm trying to build just a reference glossary for all of the terms on the different tabs of Sketchbox. But I definitely did and would again in the future with my high school students preload some vocabulary. And so before students ever start working with the model, before they start the lesson, I would start by introducing some vocabulary that I knew that they might struggle with. And so as an instructor, I do think that that's really important. And it might be important for me actually to add some teacher's notes to this that would recommend, what would be the best to work on in that sense. Thank you, Pat, for that idea. Yeah. Okay. Maybe let's go ahead and move to, let's move ahead to group two, please.
Yeah, I can speak for group two.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually echoing the last comment, we at first didn't notice the results on the bottom because you had to scroll down together. So we were kind of looking at the graphs like, do we need to get the numbers from here? So if there's a way to move those up or just highlight that a little bit better. We thought overall, though, the lesson was pretty good, good way to familiarize students with using the tool. What we found ourselves wondering about, we were thinking about, the square footage, is given an area that's different than the volume of the building and, what effects that would have on, HVAC systems. So just kind of, thinking of what other, parameters could affect that. And then what extensions, maybe doing all of those different, comparing the two locations and doing all the different modifications just to see how they compare.
Yeah, got it. So run a parallel set of calculations for a different window area, different size of building in Chicago and in LA.
Right.
Got it. Yeah, interesting. Good. Anyone else from group two have anything they'd like to add? And then we'll move on to our last group.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing in there regarding the maybe physics and mathematics portion of it. One thing that we really like to do early on is talk about graphing data, dependent variables and independent variables. And I think especially even like a standardized test like ACTs, or even going forward into the industry, understanding like when you look at a graph, how to interpret that data. And so I think that is a really good opportunity for students to kind of get a graph and take data off of it and be able to understand, how, people don't read you data numbers anymore. You have to be able to take a graph and interpret that. And I really like that about this.
Yeah, that I really like what you said there, Joe. You could actually take some screenshots and put them into some online resources. You could ask students to interpret graphs without providing them the numerical data. You could do that as well. After they've used Sketchbox, you could create some of your own resources to encourage them to do that. So that's really nice.
Or even like taking that screenshot and then say, guess this location, right? Am I in the northern part of the United States or the southern part of the United States? And they should be able to tell by the amount of, money spent on heating or cooling. You should be able to maybe guess the climate. So.
Yeah, that's nice. You could make sort of a matching exercise where you provide 4 annual energy cost graphs, and maybe your locations are Boston, Miami, Phoenix, and Seattle, for example, and you could ask students to match a location to a graph and offer some explanation. Yeah, that'd be really nice. And but a nice extension to do after students have some familiarity with Sketchbox, of course, so they understand the nature of that graph and how it's developed and what it means. Yeah, good. Okay, let's move on to group 3. I think we've got a spokesperson for group 3 as well, I hope.
Well, I'll speak for group 3 since I'm on camera. Overall, we was able to go through the lesson seamlessly, by following the prompts. And so we feel that it would be a nice way to introduce this to students. And I guess while I was listening to the other participants, as I'm looking at the results table now, our results table is based on one project. It would be nice if right on the tool, you can have at least 3 versions of the results. So that way, as you're looking at one, it's just there. And so like, you can see the changes, so it's like, okay, this, the tab with the size and dimensions and windows. And then if we make a change to it, a code that says, well, edit to, we change the square footage in the windows. And then we can really see the comparison there with the results, as opposed to, because sometimes when you're going to the tables back and forth, something might get lost, and that's just, I was wondering if that's something that is there already, or can it be done?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a way to do something like that. It's done using what's called a measures set, and we'll look at it actually in lesson 2.
Okay.
And so, yeah, we'll get to, yeah. So you're anticipated really well. And I didn't think about this earlier, but there's something really even more important underlying what you've identified there, which actually comes back to something that came up before. If you're making multiple changes to a building and you want to compare them, everything side by side, you really can make a mistake. And maybe you change something in one example and there's something that's not reset properly that you don't anticipate. So being able to do a side-by-side comparison automatically is really important. And so, yeah, we'll examine that with measure sets for sure. And I'm going to actually add that to my list of technical questions for 215 too. We'll see what we can learn in our technical session about another way to work on that. So, yeah, that's really good. A really good idea, Anthony. Thank you.
And I was thinking too for students. Is it possible for a building that they already know about some of the data to be imported into the tool? So for instance, if we start off with a school, or in my area, if we start off with it, if we say, hey, let's start off with the Empire State Building and see if we make, get some baseline data on their energy usage and say, okay, if we add more windows, if we take away more windows. And they may start with a connection because they have a connection to that building. And now as we go to our own designs, then that energy usage, once they made that connection, it just might be, they might have more buy-in to the lesson with that.
That's a cool idea.
So that's a great idea, and I can tell you that in the Slipstream YouTube video channel, there's an example in which there's a case study for a library in Wisconsin, in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. And I think that actually is a video. We've met Lee this morning. I think Lee actually created that video, if I'm not mistaken. And that actually goes through exactly that process of how you would take a building and try to fit the parameters in Sketchbox to an existing building using some mapping tools and some other things. You can actually use Google Earth, among other things, to help with that as well, to make some measurements. And it really, there are some really nice connections in terms of things like aspect ratio and other things that are additional mathematical calculations and parameters that are really interesting for students to learn about too. So this is the green energy career map. And every one of these open circles is a green buildings career, green buildings. And so entry-level careers here at the bottom in 4 different parallel tracks, mid-level careers and advanced careers. And every one of these, you can click on that circle to get a title and a brief description of that career. So this is a sustainable construction supervisor or a lead project manager. But then you can also click on this for a job detail that actually goes into much more specific detail, including salary range, required education and training, preferred education and training, skills requirements, and then advancement routes into other careers. And so this is a really fantastic resource to use. It's freely available, and there are some great connections here, obviously. So it's linked here in the slides, and I'll drop the link also into the chat in case you want to record it in that way. But that's really valuable. And Create actually has a lesson that I may talk about right at the end of our work today that actually has some student questions that go with using these career maps, actually. And I'm happy to share that with you. So I'll just put the link in the chat for right now.
It's done.
Oh, thank you. Then additionally, if we jump back into our own slides for the presentation today, in Wisconsin, the Department of Public Instruction has just created a new energy career pathway with several tracks. And so that URL is actually here. And Samara, if you don't mind, if you could actually put what you think would be the most accessible URL into the chat for us also for that, that would be fantastic. And so these career maps actually work on 2 parallel pathways: energy generation and conservation, or energy transmission, distribution and storage. And they describe careers at different levels of training. So high school diploma, certification or technical diploma, apprenticeship, associate's degree, or bachelor's degree, and beyond. And so those are new, they're exciting, and we'll get some resources from Samara about those. So that's another way for us to access this information. Here actually is just a screenshot from the DPI Energy Career Pathway, so you can get a sense of what that might look like. This is the energy generation and conservation path, and you can see the different educational levels on the left side here: high school diploma, certification or technical diploma, registered apprenticeship, and so on. So those are fantastic resources available to our students to make them aware of many, many different types of careers. And then additionally, this is a screenshot of the Create lesson for career maps. In addition to the green buildings career map, there's a similar document for wind, bioenergy, climate control, and solar. And all of these can be used in the lessons that Create has provided. So I'll share more about those if we have time at the end, but you can find them from the Create website that we've referenced already in the educator resources. And then finally, Slipstream has some great career energy video profiles. And so there are 9 of them. I'll actually grab this. Oops, I'm sorry. I'll actually grab that link and get that in the chat as well. And so this is also really exciting. These are nice video profiles of 9 different careers, and just another way for students to engage with this type of information. So what we're doing relates to many, many careers where there's a shortage of employees right now. And there's great information to help students learn about them and learn about how they would be compensated, what would be required, and what training they would need. So really good resources. Now, I want to make just some brief comments before we start our second lesson, although Samara, do you have a quick comment?
Yeah, I was just going to give a shout out to my colleagues at Keep who developed the lessons that are companions to each of those 9 clean energy career videos. So these are ready to go lessons. It's got the Google Slides as well as student assessment forms that are in there as well. And you're welcome to copy the slides and edit them as you need, but it's a good way as you're doing academic and career planning in the middle school and high school to use those. So just want to pop that in there.
Excellent. Thank you, Samara. And I'm going to add that link to the Slipstream resources. So in lesson number 2, we're going to be talking about a little bit about energy codes. And so when a building is designed, it's designed to meet local energy code. But local energy code is not the same in every place. And so there are 2 main code organizations that provide energy codes. One is the International Code Council, which creates a code called the International Energy Conservation Code. That is the default code that we used in our first lesson. In fact, we used the 2018 IECC Energy Code. We basically modeled a building that would be built to meet that building code. There's a parallel set of codes that's produced by the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, often referred to as ASHRAE. And each of those organizations updates their codes on a 3-year cycle. And so a municipality may choose to use the most recent code, or it may take a number of years for codes to be updated. I think some states work with a state energy code, but other states don't, and it's up to local municipalities to make decisions about that. And so the code matters, though, and I think it's a really nice way for students to learn about the way that regulation and government interact with buildings and the function of buildings and the local ordinances. So that's available in Sketchbox, and we're going to be studying it in the next lesson. Additionally, there is a tab in Sketchbox we've not explored yet. It's called the Baseline tab. There are approximately 40 different building parameters that can be set. And what I mean by a building parameter, I mean something like what we've looked at already. So the percentage of window space that's on a wall, or it might be, for example, the thermal properties of the insulation. And so all of those can be changed one at a time, or can be changed to match a building that you're trying to model. And so this next lesson will look at those a little bit. And then finally, there are also some preset upgrade measures. And so this is a set of 16 common measures that are often upgraded in a building. And it will actually select preset values for all of them that are better than the code. So in other words, you run a model, it's modeling a building that's designed to meet energy code, but that's the minimum. You might want your building to be better. And it might cost you more to build that building, but you may actually see a return, an economic return over time because of the avoided energy cost. And so that's part of what this model is designed to help you do. And so in this next lesson, we'll also be using what's called the Measures tab. And those are sort of 2 of the next main tabs that we find in Sketchbox. In the Measures tab, every parameter that you can change has 3 values. One is called No Change, which matches code. One is called Better, which is what a typical upgrade might be. And one is called Best, which is sort of the best upgrade that you could do without being really cost prohibitive. And so we'll see how those work out when we get into our modeling in a little bit. Okay, the specific baseline parameters that are available fall in different categories. So building envelope, skylights, internal loads, heating and cooling, glazing, lighting, domestic hot water, and ventilation. And this would be something that before students worked on this second lesson, this would be an example of vocabulary that would be really good for students to have a little bit of front loading to understand a little bit better the way that these work. So for students to understand that glazing is referring to window glass, for example, is really important. Okay, and so these are the types of upgrades that you'll be making to the building. The lesson proceeds again step by step with illustrations and screenshots in the lesson materials so that you can work with them in that way. And for an example, you can just see what some of these values in the baseline tab look like. So here, the roof U value, a measure of how well the roof material conducts thermal energy is set to be 0.032 BTU per hour per square foot per degree Fahrenheit of temperature difference. And you can change that. And we're going to change that to a typical value that might be an upgrade for adding extra insulation to a building. So the 4 parameters we'll look at specifically in this lesson are the roof U value, the solar heat gain coefficient of the window glass, how much thermal energy is coming through that window glass, the interior lighting power, how much electrical power do you need to get the level of light that you need for your occupants to do what they need to do inside the building. And then also the thermal efficiency, that is this %E sub TH, the thermal efficiency of the heating equipment for the building. Think of that as like the efficiency of a gas furnace, for example, that you might have in your home.
I think the only thing we talked about in our group was looking at the just the baseline improvement measures. And one of the reasons that I think we're seeing such a drastic savings with the electrical lighting is because its improvement from no change to better was much larger, right? In terms of the, it went from, I forget what it was now, but it went from,
it's a change of about 40%, I think.
yeah, so it went from
Nearly
0.81 to 0.59, where the other ones, especially like the roof insulation, is much smaller change, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that I just want to make sure that as the students are, if I was going to give this assignment to students, that they understood that, like, well, we're only increasing the roof insulation by, an R of 2, but we're putting in a completely different lighting system, right? Like we're trading out a very inefficient one for a much more efficient one. And that's why you're seeing greater savings there.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I think I'm actually going to add that, I think, to our technical questions list, because my understanding is that the extent to which those measures change is based on what is more or less economically feasible. And I think recently there's been such rapid development in lighting technology with the way that LED lighting has been instituted, that I think that we might be sort of at a unique time frame in the way that lighting works, in that the sense that the codes could be changing really rapidly to reflect that. What's interesting also about the lighting, of course, and this comes up in conversation with students, is that if you have lighting that is a lower power lighting, but still providing the actual light intensity you need for your interior building tasks, that the power that you're not putting into the space as an additional load, as thermal energy, is sort of saving you in other places as well. You're not running your cooling system in the same way. And so that's also really significant, the way that one measure, it seems like it might be doing just one thing, but it actually impacts other areas as well. So there is some good discussion there, but I'm really glad for what Corey said. I noticed too that lighting, especially the change, is very aggressive. And so let's find out a little bit more about technically why that is. I have some speculation, but let's find out. Yeah, thank you, Corey.
Hey, Jim, I just want to say one more thing. And Corey had mentioned this in our breakout. I believe that when you look at the roof insulation and the wall insulation, Corey had mentioned if you take the inverse of that value or those units, you get R value.
Yes, so, that's right.
Anyway, so I'm not sure if that got mentioned before or whatever, but I think that's something that I will definitely carry into my classroom, because my students will understand R value. And so anyway, I thought that was an important note that Corey had.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a good point. I think I might have mentioned U value is part of the front loading vocabulary, but R value is not here, but should be added, shouldn't it? Because of the connection between them. Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. Yeah, that's right on. Okay, great. So just to bring us into lunch.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Pat has a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, just real quick. I know you have a tremendous amount of technical stuff you're trying to get across to students here, but certainly teaching this in the Bronx, which is what Anthony Johnson's going to be, I would love to see at least a short discussion on, what is ASHRAE, what is the role of a private policy, what is the role of a private group of professionals in terms of impacting what ends up being government regulations, right? Government policy. I just think for so many young people, they just haven't had the experience from, you know, people don't read daily newspapers anymore and stuff like that, of understanding what all this means, besides being a lot of, you know, technical data. There's real people here that are changing the way we live by virtue of collaboration. And I would just, not that you have to change, you know, your program, but I would maybe just, it could be a note or something that this would be a good place for a policy discussion.
Right, and I think that ties in also to when we're talking about careers, because one of the biggest levers that comes into climate mitigation is good policy. And so addressing that careers around policy are also solutions to all the different problems that we have in society. And we really saw that in the last exercise, where we're looking at the different codes, and those aren't just magical. I mean, communities adopt those through democratic process and policy making. So I think that is an opportunity to share, you know, students who maybe aren't interested in buildings in particular, but lean towards that. It's a chance for them to feel included as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the conversations I've had in a different group is that maybe a local municipality is using the 2015 code. And so students could model a building for the 2015 IECC code, and then model it for the 2018 code, and then head to the school board and say, by the way, we have this new building we're building. We could do this, but if we did this instead, we'd be code compliant in the future, and also it would give us this energy savings. And so it's already available. Let's do that. So
Yeah.
It could allow students to be advocates. And I like the heart of your original question too, Pat. I think that a discussion about policy and what the organizations are, and then, you know, I think students should actually just write to the city government in your borough in the Bronx and say, just ask, what energy code are we using? You know, I for the Bronx, I don't know, and they, I'm sure, don't. But it would be interesting for them just to engage with the city to find out.
Yeah.
For example. So yeah, the next few lessons that are developed are lessons that investigate scheduling and its impact on building energy. And so what I mean by that is that this really in some ways is motivated by an experience that I had. I used to teach at a school where for some reason the ventilation and heating and cooling systems would run until about 8 p.m. And I'm not really sure why that was, because the building was generally empty at that time. And so in Sketchbox, you have access to a chance to change the schedule of a building. And so if the building is generally unoccupied starting at, let's say, 4 p.m., for example, a middle school that ends at school at 3:15 and the building is mostly empty, then you can go to nighttime setbacks, for example. And so this is something, of course, that we think will save energy. And Sketchbox is a tool that will help tell us, you know, make an approximation of how much energy that it will save. The other thing that we'll do in lesson 3 is actually have a chance to look at the set points for the building. And so by a set point rather than a schedule, what I mean is that the building, let's say during the winter heating season, is set to maintain the building temperature at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And so there has to be a decision about that set point. The building that I work in happens to actually be set to 72, which seems a little bit high to me in the heating season. But a building could be set, for example, at 68. And so this is one of the things that in our own homes that we know that we have control over. We can change the thermostat set points to conserve energy and to avoid the emissions that come from that energy consumption. And so this, of course, is something that students wonder about. And so the third lesson that I've made actually focuses on scheduling and set points. I've also made a fourth lesson that I'll distribute in just a bit. This one talks about carbon equivalent emissions. And this actually turns out to be really interesting because the way that this that Sketchbox sources utility data, it works in the US on a state-by-state model. And so I happen to live in Wisconsin, which borders Illinois. Illinois, a large portion of the power is from nuclear power, electrical generation, and that's not the case in Wisconsin. And so the carbon emission impacts of using a certain amount of electricity are very different in Wisconsin than they are in Illinois. And so this is something that students can model in Sketchbox, and that leads to much broader conversations about resource utilization and about the ways in which we generate electricity, for example. So that's really important. And I think we'll have a little bit of time to talk about actually electrification of heating and cooling. And there are a few quirks with trying to model, for example, heat pump systems in Sketchbox. And so I'll mention a few things about that if our timing seems to work out. So that's what's coming for us in lesson 3 and 4. Before we get to those lessons, I would like to first just talk a little bit about my experiences using this with my own students. I didn't really know what to expect when I started working with Sketchbox about 1.5 years ago, but I generally found that my students were very engaged with this, partly because they can ask questions and almost immediately find answers to them. And so my strategy was to really use something similar to what we did in lesson 1 today, which is to make very few changes to a building. That's not modeling a building that they're familiar with, but it shows them what the system can do. And so if you were trying to make connections to a local building, to students' own school building, that might be a very logical second step. But I think to take a building, make tiny modifications, and then immediately show them what the model does is the fastest way to help students understand what this tool can do, so their imaginations can start to run on what they'd like to find out. And so to support that, I think the easy access to results is really important. I think I've found that students really want to explore independently very quickly. And as timing allows, I certainly encourage that. And interestingly, I actually ran this with a group of volunteer students over lunch from one of my classes when I wrote some new lessons. And one of the students came back a few weeks later and said, I really liked when we did that energy modeling. Could we do more? Is there more that we can do? So that was very satisfying as an instructor, of course, that students were interested in this. Here are just a few quotes that my students have given. They found it interesting how you can change small factors and they can make a large impact on a building, or they might not. I know students are interested in the connection this has to architecture and the way buildings are designed. This third quote, actually, I asked students to do some calculations in lesson 1 about moving their building to Los Angeles. And they were really pretty stunned that the building in that location in Los Angeles, California, here in the US, uses less energy, but the energy costs more. And so it really let them know that energy is very local. And that really was an important lesson, I think, that came out of this. Okay, so I think we're just about ready to head back to lesson 3 and 4. So I'm going to distribute those. We'll spend one last section in our breakout groups. But before we do that, I'm actually going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to transition actually back to Sketchbox because I'd like to just make a few comments. I don't think that everyone in lesson 2 made it all the way to the measures sets. And I'd like to just show a few things that I think would be helpful for everyone to know from that. That just would have been helpful as I was getting started myself. So here is Sketchbox again. And so if I switch to the measures tab, right now there's nothing selected. And measures are a way to change a large number of variables at the same time. And so if I use the icon that's right here, if I hover over it, it actually expands to tell me that this is to add a measure set, an entire set of measures. And so I'm going to add this standard measure set that's built into Sketchbox. And what it defaults to is sort of the best economically efficient upgrade to something like a roof value, for example. Now, I'm really glad that Corey made some important comments about this before. Here's the efficient interior lighting. For this particular type of building, this starts out as 0.729 watts per square foot, and then down to 0.59 and down to 0.5, which is almost a 50%, almost a 33% change rather, to get from the baseline to the best. And so, of course, that's going to have a significant impact, that large of a change. But additionally, not every one of these measures corresponds to the same amount of energy. So for example, lighting may account for more or less energy than heating. And so there are a number of different scaling factors that are happening at the same time with all of these. And so it's interesting to keep that in mind. And it's interesting also how really complex modeling a building can turn out to be. And so what I'll do is actually take this measure set. I'm just going to apply it and we're just going to run the results. And what we'll see if you didn't get this far is that where some of our models ran very, very quickly. Oh, this one actually did run quickly this time. And so here we've basically taken a building. We've taken 16 major improvements that we could make, and we've run them all to basically the top economically feasible level. And so we would expect to see really large changes. And so energy costs, for example, the annual energy cost for the building that we're modeling here is about $117,000. And if we make all of the upgrades that we talked about, we would find that the energy cost drops all the way down to about $72,000 US. So that's an enormous change, 38% relative savings. And that's the kind of thing that these measure sets can be used to demonstrate. And so in a way, it's really a way to even show students, here is a building that actually meets energy code, but then, you know, what's possible to really make it better. And then that starts to open the door for cost benefit analysis calculations. I did give that disclaimer before that it's a little bit difficult to nail down costs for many of these things. I recommend if you do research on that, trying to find a range of costs and let students sort of explore it in that context, and to talk about the uncertainty in projects like this. Interestingly, also notice that the annual summary table is here actually at the top of our results now, not after all of the charts. And so that is interesting that reordering happens. This chart right here is also specific to applying the measure sets. Notice that this actually steps through every one of the measures. Here's the roof insulation, the wall insulation, air sealing, and actually demonstrates for us which was the most effective based on the level of improvement that we made. And so you can hover over these bars to find the actual dollar value saved each year. And you can also change this to not be energy cost, for example, but maybe we want carbon cost instead. And that actually can reveal some additional really interesting discussions. Notice right here that we've improved the solar heat gain coefficient of the windows. And it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a little red bar right here. This saved us negative 818 kilogram equivalents of carbon dioxide. And so you might wonder why in the world does that happen? We put on better windows and we're spending more energy. What's happened here? And so this is a cold climate, and this is not improving the thermal property of how the window transfers thermal energy at night, for example. This is improving how much thermal energy comes through the window to warm the space inside. And so we're in a cold climate. And what we've just done basically is said that we're going to get less solar heating in our building during the heating season. And so because of that, we're spending more heating fuel likely to make up for that. And now our building actually is, in that particular measure, is actually behaving in a way that we don't want it to behave from a carbon standpoint. So that's a very interesting fact that you wouldn't otherwise know without doing this type of modeling. Okay, so, and then you can see also there's some numerical summary data for this as well, but that's the measure set. I know not everyone got a chance to explore it, and there's really a lot to explore right there. I will actually try to just go back to, I'm going to go back to the measure set, for example. You can change them one at a time to either the better or the no change, or to a custom value. And so that's definitely possible. Or if you decide you're not going to work with the measures, you can just remove them all at once. And so I'm now going to just go back to what's called the baseline tab, which you'll have a chance to work with, I think, in lesson 4. And notice here you can change independently any of these things that you would like to change. And so, for example, maybe I just want the U value, the thermal property of the roof, to be a little bit better. And so I'll move it down to maybe 0.028, and I'll run the model. And the limitation of that compared to working with a measure set is that I don't get the same level of data display. And so I do have all of the data summary that we are used to from before, but notice I don't have a baseline and a proposed column to compare to at the top. And I also don't have that chart that shows me measure by measure what the improvements have been compared to that baseline. So there's, again, a lot more to explore here, but I wanted to just give a quick navigation of that. I'm going to pause here for questions. before we head back to one last short foray into our group breakout rooms rather. The question came up, lesson 2 asked us to calculate percentage saved. Is this already shown in the annual summary under relative savings? And so if you're doing a measure set, that is exactly the same number. And the reason that I added it into the lesson was partly to instruct students into the way that it was calculated so that they understood how the calculation was being done. And then also to let them practice the calculation and compare their results with what they found in the simulation. And so that was exactly right. That's a great question. And it does match what we see there. Okay, good. Any other questions while we're here? Otherwise, I'll start to distribute lesson material. And I will say this time in your breakout room, I'm sending material for lesson 3 and 4. Yes, so this question, I'm glad this came up because I know we have some international attendees and we were anticipating that. Sketchbox right now is limited to the weather library in the US, unfortunately. And so I'm sure that that's because of the fact that it's connected to DO2, which functions from the US Department of Energy. So that's a limitation right now. Thank you, Drew, for helping to address that. Yes, question from Gabriel DeBame, Gabe DeBame. I think that it's possible to adjust the building sort of by azimuth angle. And so if a building is not facing, directly south, for example, I think that's definitely possible. Maybe someone from Slipstream will jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I was actually doing that about 2 days ago. It's not something I've done a lot of, but I think that's definitely possible to adjust the azimuth angle. Yeah, thank you for that. Any other questions? You're welcome to drop them into the chat or really just unmute yourself and go ahead.
We have another question from Craig here. What about irregular shaped buildings?
Yeah, thank you. I have less of an answer about that, but actually good. So we've got some information from Lee in the site menu. I remember now, thank you, Lee. In the site menu, there's a way to adjust site orientation. And so actually, I'm gonna open up Sketchbox in just a second and we can navigate to that tab. I'll show that just quickly. So thank you, Lee, for that. Irregular shaped buildings, I think actually are a little bit harder. I actually was wondering about that recently. I was looking at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, which is more of a trapezoidal shaped building. And so I ended up approximating the building as a rectangular shape of the same area. And so that's harder to do. It's certainly not impossible in DO2, for example, where I believe that you can actually, you can send AutoCAD files, for example, of a building layout into DO2. And so it's possible in the background. I'm not sure that it's easily possible in Sketchbox. So we're gonna add that to our technical questions list. And we'll bring that back at 2:15 and talk with our experts about that. The question has come up when I've talked to educators about Sketchbox, about integrating renewable energy. And Sketchbox has a way to do that, but the way to do that is not site specific. And so that's really kind of tricky. You can, I think, tell it how much renewable energy that you are generating from, let's say, solar, for example, but you can't have it calculate at your site what that generation would look like. And so the resource that I recommend is actually what's called PV Watts. And I am not really going to do a demonstration of it here, but I will say that Create has a very good lesson that's built to use PV Watts. And also, I think there are some tutorials available from NREL, which is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which produces and hosts PV Watts. And so it's a great resource. You can basically design a solar array and describe the tilt angle, the orientation that the array is facing. It takes weather data, usually from within a few miles of where you're located. It includes all sorts of things like cloud cover and snow losses, and they're all tunable parameters. And it's a really great resource. So I encourage you to check it out, but we won't take time really to look at it right here. But that's a really nice way to start modeling renewable energy with your projects. Okay, and so the next thing that I would like to do, I don't know that I even need to share my screen to do this. You've seen the first 4 lessons that I developed for my students based on what I thought were some of the most important things for them to know about Sketchbox and to start thinking about related to building energy. And so I wanted to just open the floor for about 10 minutes just to get some feedback from everyone here about if you were going to develop a lesson, and some of you are, I think, are Wisconsin educators. What do we need next? What would be useful for us to develop for you to use next? Or where do we go next from our set right here? What should we look at with Sketchbox? I would say, please just unmute yourself and let's have a nice discussion.
Deb, we can't hear you if you're speaking.
No, I wasn't speaking.
So one thing that I think would be useful, and obviously there's a lot of software, probably engineering that goes into this, but if we could change, or if we could have some sort of modeling of what we expect 2030 to look like for climate, whether that's in the parameters, everything goes up by 10 degrees or whatever the case is. I think it'd be interesting for students to kind of get that idea of like, hey, if I'm going to design a building based on right now, I can see what it's going to cost, but what is it going to be in 10 years? And I think that leads, for me, into more of that renewable energy kind of conversation.
And I wonder if there are any like assumptions that are out there Scott Williams might know on where utility costs projections are for 2030. I have no clue.
And maybe that's the lesson development right there, is a little bit of research to say what like I'm from the Midwest in Wisconsin, and maybe that's a lesson that I create with my students and say, hey, it costs this to run our school right now. What will it cost in 10 years? Or whatever the case is.
I think some of the Slipstream folks might have done that, and maybe independent of Sketchbox. And I know we had a PhD student, do some work on kind of building and effects of climate change.
I'm going to jump in just for a second. Thank you, Scott. I hear 2 separate issues here, really. One is that utility costs are going to increase, but the other is that weather conditions are going to change. And so I think one way to model the utility cost would be exactly what Scott was suggesting. I think there are projections from various groups. I'm really glad to hear there's one from Wisconsin. And so maybe I will just very briefly share yep, I've got it right here. I'll just very briefly share my screen. And so on the project tab, where you set the location, you can see that we have the CO2 equivalents for electricity and also the cost of electricity. And so there are default values there for every state in the US, but you can change them. And so if you imagine that electricity is going to increase by 33% in 10 years in Illinois, you can make that change and then run your model. And so that would address one of the issues, but of course you'd have to find the projection that you're going to use. And as far as the effects of climate change, one thing you might be able to do is try to find a location that matches more likely what you anticipate your location will evolve into. So for example, maybe in Madison, Wisconsin, I find a location that's 200 miles south and east of where that actually might be in Lake Michigan. But anyways, you try to find a location in the current US that has weather conditions that are more similar to what you anticipate. And so there'll be a lot more guesswork with that, but that might be a way to sort of say, let's find out our conditions are going to be more extreme, and also energy is going to be more expensive. And so let's go ahead and do that. Scott, it looks like put a link for us in the chat. And Scott, I actually want to follow up. I couldn't tell if your audio cut out before, if you had more that you wanted to add. So I apologize if I cut you off.
And what about dynamic elements for facades? Do you think would be possible to evaluate them, because they exchange their shaded quantity along the year? And I would say that it was a good strategy to accommodate sudden weather changes along each season. So I've heard that the Energy Plus has a way that you can use the same tools as schedule, so it can vary along the year. But I was wondering if Sketchbox has something similar to predict this dynamic facade elements.
Gabriel, let me make sure that I understand. You're thinking about things like vegetation and how shading would change over time across the year, and how
not vegetations, but responsive facades, for example,
that
yes, exchange its aperture based on the internal loads, indoor temperature.
So there is a way to do there. I'm sure there is a way to add things like overhangs, for example. And what I don't know is if they respond to, like, if in addition to the solar radiation, if the solar angle of elevation, for example, is modeled accurately throughout the year. It might be. In fact, maybe I would be surprised if it's not. I'm going to carry that over to our technical questions. But then you're talking more also about responsive facades, and that, yes. And so let's carry those over to our technical. I know there is a way to do overhangs and to model shading and that sort of thing, but I'm not positive about sort of active response, that sort of characteristic. But I'm going to carry it into our Q&A. Thank you. That's really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. We've got another link from Samara in the chat, also about, I think this is future building energy use. Yeah.
It's just what the future weather in one part of the country might be like. So we could, like you were saying, we could think about what it might be like in 2050 in Wisconsin. This will tell us that it's going to be similar to weather in Arkansas. So we can model Arkansas weather and build a model around Arkansas weather. And even though we're in Wisconsin, that might be what 2050 Wisconsin building energy use is. I cannot even find the words to say this, so I don't know how I would teach it. Good luck, Joe. Let me know how it goes.
I think that's a great adaptation. That's exactly what I was thinking about. Thank you, Samara. That's a good resource. Good. Other thoughts? Other thoughts about what lesson you'd like to see next, or what we would add here?
Maybe specify the materials exchange when we go to the measures area, and we choose better, best, and what kind of material it is exchanging from one to another.
I like that. So I like that a lot. Let me make sure that I understand what you're saying. Let's say we choose energy efficient lighting. We're making a change to the lighting system. You actually describe, we're likely changing from this type of technology to this type of technology, or we're tuning the light intensity or something like that. Or if we are upgrading the roof thermal conductivity, the U value, how are we doing it? We're adding more insulation, what type of insulation it is, how thick it is, to specify like physically what happened. That's a great idea. I like that a lot. So you're going to make a change in this number, but if you went to a real building, how do you actually make the change in that number? Yeah, that's great. That's really good.
Okay, and make it easier for architects, professionals to use, instead of need to know deeply, the thermal stuffs, would make it easier.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways you could say we're changing to this type, we're making this change. What number would go with the change that we want to make? You could say, in the real world, we're, and on the residential side, for example, if you were going to change an asphalt roof to a metal roof, that has energy implications. It's one of the things that's happening in the US housing market now. And so you don't know the number you want to change to, you know the material that you want to change to, and how do you correlate them? Yeah, that's very good. I like that. Other thoughts? I'll take just another minute to take more thoughts about this, and you're always welcome to email me later on to exchange ideas. I'm happy to think and work more on this. Other thoughts for right now? Okay, in that case, what I think we should do, let's take a 5-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to arrive at our technical Q&A session. So we'll be working on that with Lee and Emily, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. I'm going to set up, I'll set up a timer when we've got 2 minutes left, and you'll know when we're going to start back up again. So take a quick break if you need one, everybody. We'll be back in 5 minutes and for our Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. So we're recording for the last time. Welcome back. We have two Slipstream expert staff with us that will be able to help answer some of our questions about Sketchbox. And Emily and Lee, if it's okay with you, what I might do is navigate myself back to the Jamboard, and I can just read the questions in, but I won't need to share my screen. And then does that sound okay, or would you rather proceed in a different way?
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay, we'll start there, and then I think we'll just have some just open Q&A as after we get through some of the responses that we've marked in already. Thanks. All right, so our first question is, how do you model a building that is brick in most areas, but also metal framed in other areas? 2 stories only for part of the building. So thoughts about mixed material buildings, I think.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something I may sometimes run across. There's, I think, kind of 2 different ways you could go about doing this. The first one is we could use that adjacency, right? So you can have 2 different shells, one of each of the materials, and have and tell Sketchbox to have them next to each other. And that would kind of allow you to use the 2 different building types. You could also do some adjustments of the baseline values to kind of do like an area weighted average of those U values to kind of accomplish the same thing. But just from a couple questions we got before, that might be a little bit more in depth, or just a little bit less clear of a method for maybe students as they're just learning. Lee, do you have anything to add to that? Any other ways that I maybe didn't think of?
Yeah, I would say, well, first, a brick building or any type of concrete masonry, that's a mass wall. So if you were looking for brick and didn't find it, mass wall is what you're looking for. And I would say, to Emily's point, when you select that option, all that's doing is changing some of the other baseline values in other parts of the model. So you could actually look and see, when you switch that back and forth, what's changing, and then you could calculate an average. I also don't know that it would make a huge impact. And actually, Drew, maybe you can weigh in there. On a 2-story building, switching from metal to brick, how much of an impact that would have?
It could, because generally the sort of the baseline, or at least the code required insulating values of a metal at least create 2 shells and assign a metal framed wall to one shell and a brick wall, or as Emily Lee referred to it, a mass wall to the other shell. And just to clarify, the shells are basically sort of blocks of buildings that you can create in Sketchbox, and you can create two of them. With the professional version of Sketchbox, you can create an unlimited number, but they're just kind of different pieces of a building that you can assemble as you want. And hopefully that answers the question, but it's a good question.
I'm going to interrupt for one brief moment. I was rude, and I didn't give Emily and Lee and Drew a chance to introduce themselves here at the beginning of our Q&A. I apologize for that. Let's take a moment and do that. Emily, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm Emily Golan. I'm an energy engineer here at Slipstream. I started with the company full-time about 5 years ago and was an intern in college before that. So I've been using Sketchbox throughout my whole time at the company, doing energy modeling for some of our energy efficiency programs with different utilities. So definitely modeled a number of different buildings in Sketchbox, and yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Great, thank you. Lee?
Yeah, I'm Lee Shaver, a senior energy engineer with Slipstream. I've been here about 5 years, and just like Emily, I started out doing just using Sketchbox for my day-to-day work. Over time, I got involved a little bit in the development, and now I do a lot of research projects, and we end up using Sketchbox to do those research projects. A great example is we modeled a microgrid community resilience center, and we used Sketchbox to generate the hourly load profile that we needed for that to be able to estimate resilience benefits of that microgrid.
Thank you. That was a great example too. Thanks, Lee. Drew.
Hi, I'm Drew Morrison. I'm an energy engineer with Slipstream, and I'm on the Sketchbox development team, so I'm actively involved in creating any new features and maintaining the software. I also use Sketchbox in our other practice. So we do a lot of consulting and energy efficiency incentive programs for different utilities. And so I've used Sketchbox to create, at this point, probably dozens of building energy models in the service of that. And I'm also involved with some of our research-oriented work as well. So I've created Sketchbox models for research, for some of our research purposes.
Great, thank you, Drew. So you can see, everyone, we're really lucky to have a great staff with us here to answer some of these questions. And also you can hopefully get a chance just to see from what they've said, all the different things that Sketchbox can do. The next question that I'd like to say is, does Sketchbox provide material specifications used on the upgrades when you select a measure? And so I think the question is, you can see the numerical change in, say, a roof U value, but does it say something about what the actual upgrade is, or what the material, what it would look like on the building? I think, Gabe, I think this question was from you, if I'm correct. Did I get it correct?
Yes, you got it.
Okay, yeah. So is there any documentation connected to Sketchbox that we make an upgrade? Does it tell us what materials or how that would look like on a real building?
Yep, that's a good question. Right now, Sketchbox is really geared towards essentially the numerical inputs that go into the models. So there is a bit of research or additional documentation or sort of legwork in a library that you would need to do to sort of translate those numerical inputs into something that may be a little bit more tangible. I think a good example of this would be maybe the U values that go into roof and wall construction. So for example, the default U value for a steel frame wall of 0.064 is basically is steel studs that are a certain distance on center with a cavity insulation of a certain R value, and then continuous insulation of a certain R value outside of that. We pulled that information from a reference that I think we alluded to ASHRAE earlier in this webinar, and ASHRAE publishes an appendix to their energy performance standard that has a number of different envelope constructions, thicknesses of insulation, and things like that, and basically tells you what those U values are. Some of the sort of maybe categorical inputs to Sketchbox are maybe a little bit more intuitive. So for example, if you're adding daylight sensors, that's, flipping daylighting from no to yes, or, changing, for example, the method of daylight dimming from a stepped method to a continuous method, that's pretty, that's pretty self-explanatory. So it depends on what kind of input it is. Unfortunately, right now, there isn't a whole lot of extensive documentation around, around sort of what is behind those numbers in Sketchbox. That's mostly taken from outside sources.
Thank you, Drew. That was a great answer. Gabe and I had talked a little bit about that question too. The next question, there was one that came up that just asking, is there a residential home model in Sketchbox other than the multifamily? And the answer was actually written into the Jamboard. And the answer is there is not. Sketchbox does not have a single family residential model. Students are interested in it. So there are actually some other tools I think that you can find that can model that. But it's not really something that can be done in Sketchbox right now. The next question I'll go to is, could educators work with students on building a model of the school that they are in? Perhaps also work with school facilities maintenance team to identify the building systems. And so I'm going to answer that question and say the answer is yes, but I wonder if our expert team could say, if you were going to start modeling a school, what are some of the first steps that you would do with students or teachers to try to get the building modeled correctly in Sketchbox?
I can take this one. I would first try to get building plans, being prepared that there aren't any up-to-date building plans available, especially if the school is older than 20, 30 years. Another really important step when you're building an energy model of an existing building is just to walk all the way through the building, get an understanding and a feel for how the space is laid out and everything like that. And then a lot of the work of building the model, you can do quite a bit of it with selecting the appropriate defaults. If it's a brick building, you select mass walls. If it's a metal frame building, you select metal walls. You can take some pictures of the outside of the building, and there's measurement tools that you can apply to a photo to estimate the ratio of windows to walls. So you can do that around all 4 sides of the building. Get out your tape measures, measure the ceiling heights, measure how long the building is in each direction, all that kind of stuff. So I would probably build a spreadsheet. That's what we do a lot of times with all the inputs I know that I'm going to need, and maybe split up into teams and have all the different students walk around the building. And somebody's got a tape measure, somebody else has a camera, other folks are making note of material types, things like that. And you could pull all the information together.
Those are great suggestions. Thank you, Lee. Our next question is one about shapes of buildings. And so this was partly answered before. And so, for example, like an L-shaped building or a building with a courtyard, for example, or even a building that has maybe a trapezoidal shape or something like that. Is it best to make an approximation, or are there ways to model different shapes of buildings in Sketchbox?
I can take this one. The general shell, as you guys might have seen earlier, is kind of either a square or a rectangle. Again, you can kind of play with the different adjacencies and the aspect ratios, right? So the aspect ratio is kind of how long is it east to west versus north and south. And if it's less than 1, it'll be kind of longer one way, higher than 1 will be longer the other way. So you can play with the adjacencies, putting those together. Kind of it's best for kind of approximations, right? You might not get the building kind of in the model to look exactly like your building in real life, but as long as you have those aspect ratios generally the same, it shouldn't affect the energy usage too much. As far as if the building isn't rectangular, it can't kind of be parsed into rectangular shapes. We've kind of used workarounds in the past where we're generally trying to look at getting the appropriate amount of envelope area. So you want to make sure that the kind of the wall area on the outside of the building matches what is in the energy model. So you might have to do some kind of math to change a trapezoid into what the same kind of wall area would be with a square or a rectangle, just to make sure you're getting the right amount of heat transfer in and out of the building.
Thank you. That's great. What about the next question is sensitivity analysis. Anyone have thoughts about how you might carry that out in Sketchbox?
Yeah, so I can take this one. sensitivity analysis is a very powerful tool, especially if you're trying to design a building and make decisions about sort of what you want to do or where you want to focus your financial resources. And so to conduct a sensitivity analysis with Sketchbox, I would recommend just using the measure screen and setting up individual measure runs, each of which contains the bounding values of the particular design, of the particular inputs or design parameters that you want to investigate. And you could conduct a sensitivity analysis, I think, just perfectly well that way. Using the table of results that the simulations produces should give you that information.
Thank you. That's great. We've got another question coming up here. This is might be a short one, but it's a tool that I'm not familiar with, and I don't know if Shumik is still with us. The question was about a tool called Comfen, K-O-M-F-E-N. I'm not familiar with that. Is that something that our experts are aware of?
No, that's not something I'm familiar with, but I'm looking at the first part of the question on comparing the results to the base case. So the base case is included in the results when you model different measures and upgrades. So I'd want to chat with him a little bit more to understand specifically what he's looking to do there.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Thank you, Lee. Two simpler questions. Can accounts be shared in Sketchbox? Is there a way to do that, or would that just be down to the users sharing a login and a password?
At the moment, that would involve sharing a login and a password. I don't believe at the present state of development there is any provisions for common or shared accounts. That could change in the future if if that's a feature that we find is highly in demand. We are trying to make sure that our development is responsive to the needs of our users. But at the present time, all accounts are individual.
Yeah, thank you. That actually makes me think of an adjacent question. If a student or an instructor modeled a building, is there a way to save the building parameters and then send those parameters that another person could upload? Is that related to the previous question?
I'm glad you asked that question, Jim, because there is a way to do that. So if you open Sketchbox, no matter which screen or which view you're in, there is a little there are a couple icons, and Lee's going to demonstrate this, but there are a couple icons at the top right of the screen. One icon is an old floppy disk, another one is a file folder, and then the one on the rightmost one is what looks like a filing box. But if you click on the floppy disk, and then at the bottom left of that dialog box is a download option, which will, if you click that, it will download a JSON file which contains a snapshot of your project, and and you can just save that to your computer's hard drive and keep it there. And then you could share that, email it, put it on a shared drive, whatever you'd like to do. And then by clicking the folder, and then again, the bottom right, there is now an upload option, and you can upload any JSON file and get that. And that's actually a common way that we internally in Slipstream share our project files among our teams, is that we download these JSON files and upload them as we need.
That's fantastic, and thanks for the demo, Lee. To me, this makes great sense. You can build a building model, and then as an instructor, you can save and send the building actually exactly to your students, for example. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I'll just add that those are text files, so you can actually very quickly and easily compare two of them directly to each other if you want to see what's changed between models.
Oh, that's really cool. Thank you. That's what you're showing us on your screen right now.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, we've reached really the last of the questions I think that we had. I have a passive house question, but we're going to let that sit just for a moment. So Emily has been preparing something to show us about adjacency. Emily, if you're ready, I think we should switch to that. But then I want to queue up another question. Corey asked if there's a way to include CO2 emissions in the results table. And so I think what Corey's referring to is that if you run not a measure set, for example, but just results, on the bottom, we have peak electricity, for example, and annual electricity consumption. But is there a way to include CO2? So we'll get to that one second. Emily, are you ready?
Yeah, I can share my
Excellent.
screen.
Thank you.
Let me know when you can all see it.
It's great.
Yeah, so there's a couple things that we talked about with the adjacency, right? One was the different wall sections and one was the different building shapes. So when you create your Sketchbox model, you can add additional shells. And as I mentioned, you can kind of change the shape of these shells and the adjacency of these shells. And each of these shells has its own parameters throughout the model. So if for some reason anything's changing, that you want one part of the building to be one way, even under the measures tab, you can change each shell individually. But as far as the design goes, if this first office shell or school shell, whatever you end up choosing, is say brick, you can make it mass and then have the office 2 and office 3 at that metal framed construction. To play with the adjacency, you have to select a parent shell. So if you select none, it'll kind of have the shell way off to the side separately. But if you choose either of the others, it will place it kind of in a group with those. You can say it's east of that or above if you want to build multiple levels where it's the top floor is mass, the first floor is steel framed or vice versa. You can kind of play with those adjacencies and move them around in the model, and then Sketchbox will automatically account for any energy transfer between the shells and then any energy transfer from the shells to the outside. Is any additional questions on that?
That's a great demonstration. Thank you, Emily. Our next question is about CO2 emissions. And I know, Lee, you responded to that in the chat. Anything else that you want to add, or could you summarize quickly just your response?
Yeah, so it's not in that table, which is maybe a good idea for us to add that, but you can calculate it manually. It's simply the kWh and therm consumption time the respective CO2 emission factor, and those are input on the project tab.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Can I add just one thing to that? There actually is a CO2 emissions output, but it's a little bit harder to get to. It's hidden in a way, but I'm just going to share my screen and show you what I'm talking about. So I've just put together, I just ran a quick model and went to the results tab, but here in the top left of the results tab, there's a download results option. If you click that, it'll download an Excel file.
I'm not seeing your screen, Drew.
Oh, you're not? Let's see. Oh, there we go.
Thank you.
You have
see
to
it now?
click twice in Zoom. It throws us
Wow.
Teams users off.
It really does. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So as I was saying, in the results tab at the top left, there's a download results option. And if you click that, it'll download an Excel file that contains these results so that you can put them in a spreadsheet. And then once you've downloaded that file, they do have a line item for CO2 equivalents, but they're just for some reason we just put that in the Excel file rather than in the actual screen. I can't remember why.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for adding that, Drew. We've got another question. This one's actually has been added to the Jamboard. And let me get back to, that. So it's in it's in pink on the right side in the middle of the front page of that Jamboard. Is it possible to evaluate each location's climate before starting modeling to understand the local weather, air temperature, humidity, wind direction graphs? So I think, Gabe, you can clarify if I'm right. I think we're asking, can you extract the climate data from the model to know, the location, but can you visualize the climate data?
Yes, exactly. Mhm.
Okay, got it.
I'll take a stab at this one to start. So the weather files are based on the TMY weather format that's from NREL, and I actually don't know. I know how to look at them in tabular format, but Drew or Emily, do you know if there's a good resource to like view summaries of that climate data?
Not off the top of my head, no.
I just put a link into the chat. You can use Climate Consultant. It takes in the weather files and creates a number of graphics that can show you the wind and temperature and different things. It's pretty easy to use. You just have to you just have to download the weather files, and there's instructions to do that on the Climate Consultant page.
That's excellent. Thank you, Corey.
And I think the weather file is included in the, no, it's not. So the weather file, it's based on the city. So if you know the city you're looking at, then you can use that same link from Corey to download the appropriate weather file.
Yeah, I just was wondering if it would be possible to make in the same app, so usually I take Climate Consultant or also CD Clima Tool, but I was wondering if the same Sketchbox could provide this, as it has the weather data inside it. So just provide the graphs and all those stuff.
Yeah, I think we could look into that. I mean, it would be handy for sure. I don't know. Not being a programmer myself, I don't know. It sounds easy, but I don't know.
Yeah. I think we have time for one or two more questions. I'm really grateful for everyone from Slipstream that's been with us today, especially in this session. I am going to put an email address in the chat, as long as this is okay with everybody at Slipstream. This is tools@slipstreaminc.org. Does that seem appropriate to everyone?
Yeah.
And so my understanding of this is that if you have a question that's come up with Sketchbox, rather than email anyone specifically, you can just email to that address, which is monitored by a number of people, and the most appropriate or first person to be able to address it, we'll try to address it for you. So I just dropped that in the chat for everybody to see. And if there are one or two more technical questions, we'll take those, and then we're going to move on to the conclusion of our workshop. Okay, I don't hear any more questions, so I'm gonna ask my passive house question. This came up this morning, actually. Someone was asking, if you were trying to build a passive building, how would you get close to that in Sketchbox? What would be a way to work on that?
That's a good question, and I think it's a very apropos question, because we were looking at something similar to that in a research project where we were investigating some passive construction methods. So what I would do from a building, at least from a building science perspective, is think about what some of the potentially most effective passive strategies would be. So things like hyper insulating a building, really working to cut down on infiltration, and then also using Energy Star appliances, very efficient lighting, and then from an HVAC perspective, probably using mechanical ventilation and using ventilation energy recovery, and then kind of applying all the I would using some some of my other resources. I would convert those into Sketchbox inputs, and then essentially create a Sketchbox model of a building that has a very well insulated, an extremely well insulated envelope, very very highly controlled internal loads, as well as the best HVAC system that I could find. And I would really use the measure screen to maybe investigate the idea of using one strategy over another, or trying to again use that iterative process to come up with what the best sort of the best paths forward to a passive building would be. Emily, Lee, either of you have anything you'd like to add?
I think you covered it.
Yeah. Excellent. I'm very grateful to our panel. I think as we say goodbye to them, Emily, Lee, and Drew, if any of you have anything you'd like to add about energy careers, or about how things look in the industry right now, from what our students would expect to move into if they were thinking about going into energy analysis and energy engineering, that would be great. If there's anything that you'd like to add, and then after that, we'll move on to our last session.
We need your students.
Thank you, Drew.
Have them join the fight against climate change. If there were, if we had some old recruiting posters, we would have those. But it's not only an intellectually challenging career, and if you have bright, interested students who are motivated, it's a great way to to be very fulfilling, and it's also a career that is going to do a lot of good.
Thank you for that. Emily, you did an internship with Slipstream. Did that start when you were in college?
Yeah, I did. I interned with Slipstream starting, I did 5 years of mechanical engineering. I started between my 4th and my 5th year. And I was able to work part-time during the semesters with the company too. So that's actually one of the things that really kind of inspired my career. I had done some work with different sustainability. I was definitely interested in the industry, but I actually didn't know a ton about energy modeling before starting with Slipstream as an intern. So I think it's really cool that a lot of you are hopefully kind of getting this out to kids younger, starting in high school, and making everybody aware that this is a career path. And just to echo Drew, it's definitely something that we all feel very passionately about, and we think will make a big difference.
Thank you for that.
I'm hoping to invite Emily to Women in Energy career panel during Women's History Month in 2024. So watch out, Emily.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out. Thank you.
Thank you. Lee, you got interrupted. I'm sorry.
No,
Thanks,
it's
Emma.
okay. Yeah, I was just going to add, I think one of the most valuable things to cultivate as a student or a teacher of students is curiosity around these things. Just yesterday and today, Drew, Jim, and I were having an email back and forth about some perplexing behavior when an outdoor air system was added to a building, and trying to understand, okay, why does the energy increase in this way? And even better than being able to use the tool to get the modeling results is the insight to know, okay, when it gives you a result that's unexpected, what's going on there with the physics? What's actually the issue here? And a lot of the questions that are included in the sample lessons of changing location and changing window sizes, being able to think through those questions, I think is, I use this tool every day, but if I didn't understand what it was actually trying to tell me, I would just be, throwing spaghetti at a wall, as they say. So having that understanding and that curiosity, I think is just critical.
I want to share, I can't give details because I'm not at liberty to do that, but it was actually students, Wisconsin students observing building energy consumption that discovered that a school district was being defrauded of tens of thousands of dollars in utility bills because of IT mining that was happening.
Hmm.
So students can make a huge difference.
That's a great anecdote. I'll share an anecdote of my own. In one of the lessons that we did today, our first lesson, we changed the window percentage on our building. And I got a chance to observe a group of students working on that problem. And they at first decided that because they were adding more windows, that the energy cost would go down because there would be less need for lighting. And then a student said, but wait a minute, it might actually go up because there's going to be more sunlight coming into the building. It's going to get warmer. We'll need more electricity for air conditioning. And then another student said, but wait a minute, what about in the winter? If you put your hand on the window, it's going to be really, really cold. And so I bet we're losing a lot of energy through the window. And so they got very quickly into this little cycle of exactly what Lee was saying about wondering, well, what is the building going to do? What's the physics of what's happening here? And that was really rewarding to see. So that's a great thing about this tool.